They left the blind alien baby in the woods until a human vagrant became her eyes. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The rain hammered down on the forest canopy above Cole Bennett's makeshift shelter, a tattered tarp stretched between two ancient oaks at the edge of the human settlement zone. He'd been living rough for 3 months now, ever since the colony ship accidents left him stranded on Verdana Prime with no way home and no credits to his name. The alien world had proven hospitable enough to humans, but the established settlements wanted documentation he didn't have, work permits he couldn't obtain, and a past he couldn't explain. So he drifted to the margins, to the borderlands between the human territories and the vast wilderness that belonged to the Theralan people, the insectoid natives who'd inhabited this planet for millennia before humanity arrived. Cole pulled his worn jacket tighter and listened to the storm. He was 42 years old, weathered by a lifetime of poor choices and bad luck, but he'd always managed to survive. That was his one talent, he supposed. Survival. Not success, not happiness, just the stubborn refusal to quit breathing no matter how hard the universe tried to snuff him out. The sound cut through the rain like a knife through silence. At first, Cole thought it was an animal, some Veralainen creature caught in a trap or injured by a predator. But as he listened, pushing aside the tarp and stepping into the downpour, he realized the sound was too rhythmic, too desperate. It was crying. Not the crying of any animal he'd ever heard, but the unmistakable wail of an infant in distress. He grabbed his flashlight, one of the few pieces of tech he still owned, and followed the sound deeper into the trees. The forest floor was slick with mud and fallen leaves, and twice he nearly lost his footing on the treacherous slope. The crying grew louder, more frantic, and Cole's heart hammered in his chest as he pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes. There, in a small clearing barely visible through the sheets of rain, he found her. She was tiny, no larger than a human newborn, but she was definitely not human. Her skin was a pale lavender color, smooth and slightly translucent, revealing delicate networks of bioluminescent veins that pulsed with a faint blue light. She had 4 arms, each ending in 3 delicate fingers, and her head was slightly larger than a human infant's, with compound eyes that should have glittered in his flashlight beam but remained dull and unresponsive. She was wrapped in a thin cloth that had once been ornate but was now soaked and torn, and she lay in what appeared to be a woven basket that had tipped over in the storm. Cole stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. This was a Theralan child, he was certain of it. But what was she doing out here, alone, in a storm that could easily kill something so small and vulnerable? He knelt beside her, and the baby's crying intensified. She was cold to the touch, her small body shivering violently. Without thinking, Cole stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her, then scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and as he cradled her against his chest, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Her eyes didn't track his movements. They didn't focus on his face or follow his flashlight. They simply stared ahead, empty and unseeing. She was blind. Cole looked around the clearing, searching for any sign of parents or guardians, but there was nothing. Just the overturned basket, the soaked cloth, and the small, crying child in his arms. Someone had left her here. Someone had abandoned a blind baby in the middle of a forest during a storm. The rage that flooded through him was surprising in its intensity. Cole had seen a lot of cruelty in his life, had lived through enough hardship to understand why people made terrible choices. But this was something he couldn't comprehend. This was innocent life discarded like trash. He turned back toward his shelter, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed, shielding the baby from the rain with his body. She continued to cry, but there was a desperation to it now that spoke of hunger and fear and a primal need for warmth. Cole had no idea how to care for a human baby, much less an alien one, but he knew he couldn't leave her out here to die. When he reached his shelter, Cole laid the baby down on his sleeping bag and began searching through his meager supplies. He had water, but he didn't know if Theralan infants could drink the same water humans did. He had some dried protein bars, but they were far too solid for an infant. He had a small camping stove and a pot, but no formula, no milk, nothing appropriate for feeding a baby. The child's crying had subsided to weak whimpers. and Cole could see her tiny chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She was hypothermic, he realized. The first priority was warming her up. He fired up his camping stove and heated water in his pot, then soaked a clean cloth in the warm water and began gently rubbing the baby's limbs, trying to restore circulation. The bioluminescent veins in her skin pulsed more brightly as warmth returned to her body, and gradually, her breathing steadied. As he worked, Cole studied her more carefully. Her forearms moved independently, reaching out and grasping at the air as if searching for something. Her mouth was small but flexible, with a pattern of ridges inside that he guessed were designed for processing soft foods. Her skin, while unusual in color, had the same delicate quality as human infant skin, soft and vulnerable. But it was her eyes that troubled him most. They were large and multifaceted like an insect's, beautiful in their complexity, but they remained unfocused and dim. There was no spark of recognition, no response to light or movement. This child had been born blind, and in a species where vision was clearly important given the size and prominence of their eyes, that would make her a burden. That's why they left her, Cole thought bitterly. Because she was imperfect. Once the baby was warm and dry, wrapped in his sleeping bag with his jacket tucked around her, Cole sat back and tried to think. He needed to feed her, but he had no idea what Theralan infants ate. He needed to find her people, but approaching a Theralan settlement as a human vagrant carrying one of their children could get him killed. The Theralans were not hostile to humans as a rule, but they were protective of their own and suspicious of outsiders. The baby made a soft chittering sound, one of her small hands finding its way to her mouth. She was trying to suckle on her fingers, a gesture so universal that it transcended species. She was starving. Cole made a decision. Tomorrow, he would venture to the nearest human settlement and try to find someone who knew about Theralan biology. Tonight, he would do what he could to keep this child alive. He diluted some of his protein bars in warm water, creating a thin gruel that might be digestible. Using a corner of his clean cloth, he dipped it in the mixture and let the baby suckle on it. To his relief, she took to it immediately, her small mouth working rhythmically as she drew the nutrition from the cloth. It wasn't ideal, Cole was sure, but it was something. As the baby fed, Cole found himself talking to her, his voice low and gentle. "So, what's your name, little one?" he said softly. "Did they even give you a name before they threw you away?" The baby's hands waved in the air, and one of them brushed against Cole's forearm. Immediately, her fingers wrapped around his finger with surprising strength, holding on as if he were a lifeline. The simple gesture hit Cole harder than he expected, and he felt something crack open in his chest, some long-dormant capacity for caring that he'd thought he'd lost years ago. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "All right, I've got you. I don't know what I'm doing, but I've got you." The baby finished feeding and almost immediately fell asleep, exhausted by her ordeal. Cole sat watching her for a long time, listening to the rain slow to a drizzle outside. The bioluminescent veins in her skin had brightened now that she was warm and fed, creating a soft blue glow that illuminated the small shelter. It was strangely beautiful, this tiny alien life curled up in his sleeping bag, utterly dependent on him for survival. Cole didn't sleep that night. He kept watch, feeding the baby whenever she woke and cried, changing the makeshift diaper he'd fashioned from an old shirt when necessary, and generally trying to keep her comfortable. By the time dawn broke, he was exhausted but committed. He couldn't give this child back to people who had abandoned her. He wouldn't. But keeping her raised 100 questions he had no answers for. How long could he keep her alive on improvised formula? What medical care would she need? How could he protect her from the elements, from predators, from the harsh realities of life on the margins of civilization? And most importantly, what kind of life could he possibly offer a blind alien infant when he couldn't even take care of himself? As the morning light filtered through the trees, Cole looked down at the sleeping baby and made a promise. "I'll figure it out," he whispered. "I don't know how, but I'll figure it out. You're not alone anymore." The baby stirred in her sleep, her small hands flexing, and Cole felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a mantle. He was a vagrant, a nobody with no resources and no prospects, but he was all this child had. And somehow, that was going to have to be enough. The next morning brought clear skies and the sharp, clean smell of rain-washed earth. Cole packed up his few belongings, fashioning a crude sling from his tarp to carry the baby against his chest. She was awake but quiet, her small hands exploring the fabric of his shirt with curious touches. He'd fed her twice more during the night, and while the protein bar gruel was far from ideal, it seemed to be keeping her stable. The walk to the nearest human settlement took 3 hours through terrain that was beautiful but unforgiving. Verdana Prime was a world of towering forests and steep valleys, with vegetation that ranged from familiar Earth analogs to utterly alien species that glowed or moved or released clouds of spores at the slightest touch. Cole had learned to navigate it over his months in the wilderness, but carrying a fragile infant made every step more treacherous. The baby, whom Cole had started calling Lyra in his head after a constellation he'd loved as a child, remained remarkably calm. She made small chirping sounds occasionally, and her hands constantly moved, exploring the world through touch since sight was denied to her. Cole found himself narrating their journey to her, describing the towering trees and the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the sound of a nearby stream, and the calls of native birds. He had no idea if she could understand him, but the sound of his voice seemed to comfort her. The settlement of New Portland appeared gradually through the trees, a collection of prefab buildings and converted cargo containers that housed about 200 human colonists. Cole had been here a few times before, always staying on the outskirts, trading scavenged materials for food or supplies. The people here knew him as a vagrant, someone to be wary of but not actively hostile toward. Today, though, Cole walked straight down the main path toward the settlement's small medical clinic. He'd wrapped Lyra more tightly in the sling, but her lavender skin was still visible, and it didn't take long for people to notice. A woman hauling water from the communal well stopped and stared. 2 men repairing a solar panel array straightened up, their hands moving toward the tools on their belts as if they might be needed as weapons. A child playing in the dirt looked up and pointed, calling out to his mother in an excited voice. By the time Cole reached the clinic, a small crowd had gathered, keeping a wary distance but clearly curious and concerned. The clinic door opened before he could knock, and Dr. Sarah Morgan stepped out, her expression shifting from professional concern to shock as she took in the sight of the alien infant in Cole's arms. "Cole, what? Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Found her in the woods last night," Cole said simply. "She'd been abandoned. She's blind, and she was dying from exposure. I kept her alive through the night, but I don't know what she needs. I don't know how to care for her properly." Sarah was in her mid-30s, one of the few medical professionals in the settlement, and she'd always treated Cole with more kindness than most. Now, she gestured for him to come inside, and the crowd parted reluctantly to let them pass. Inside the clinic, Sarah directed Cole to an examination table and carefully helped him unwrap Lyra from the sling. The baby chirped softly as she was laid down, her 4 arms reaching out uncertainly. "She's their Alan," Sarah said, stating the obvious as she pulled on gloves and began a careful examination. "A newborn, maybe 3 or 4 days old based on the development I'm seeing. Her eyes, you said she's blind?" "Completely, as far as I can tell," Cole confirmed. "She doesn't respond to light at all." Sarah produced a small medical scanner and passed it over Lyra's body, studying the readout with a furrowed brow. "Her vital signs are weak but stable. She's dehydrated and malnourished, but considering what she's been through, she's in better shape than I would have expected. What have you been feeding her?" Cole explained about the protein bar gruel, and Sarah nodded slowly. "It's not ideal, but it probably saved her life. Thralan infants have a similar digestive system to human babies, actually. They're born with the ability to process a wide range of nutrients. I can synthesize something closer to proper formula. But, Cole, do you understand what you've gotten yourself into? I found a dying baby, and I didn't let her die," Cole said, his voice flat. "I understand that much." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "The Theralans have very strict cultural practices around imperfect births," she said quietly. "I've studied their society as much as I can, tried to understand their ways so I could provide medical care if needed. Blindness, deformity, any condition that would prevent a Theralan from contributing fully to the hive, it's considered a kindness to return such children to nature. They see it as sparing both the child and the community from suffering." They left her to die because she's blind, Cole said, anger creeping into his voice. By their understanding, yes, Sarah confirmed. And if you keep her, if you try to raise her, you'll be going against their customs. They could demand her return. They could claim you're holding her against their laws. Then their laws are wrong, Cole said simply. Lyra made a soft sound, and one of her hands found Cole's finger again, wrapping around it with that same surprising strength. He looked down at her, at this tiny, vulnerable life that had somehow become his responsibility in the span of a single night. Sarah followed his gaze, and something in her expression softened. You know I have to report this, she said. The settlement council will want to know, and they'll probably want to contact the Theralan authorities. Then they can contact whoever they want, Cole said. But they're not getting her back. Not to abandon her again. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Let me prepare some proper formula and some supplies. Basic medical equipment, diapers, bottles modified for Theralan anatomy. You'll need all of it if you're serious about this. I'm serious, Cole said. Sarah worked quickly, gathering supplies from the clinic storage and explaining to Cole how to prepare the formula, how to check for signs of illness in a Theralan infant, what developmental milestones to watch for. She was thorough and professional, but Cole could see the worry in her eyes. The Theralans are not going to like this, she said as she helped Cole pack the supplies into a donated backpack. In the settlement council, they're going to want to avoid conflict with our neighbors. They might force you to give her up. Let them try, Cole said quietly. By the time he left the clinic, word had spread through the entire settlement. People lined the path as he walked back toward the forest, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, concern, and disapproval. Cole heard whispers, caught fragments of conversations about the crazy vagrant who'd stolen a Theralan baby, about the trouble he was bringing down on all their heads. But he also saw a few faces that held something different. An elderly woman who nodded at him with what might have been respect. A young man who stepped forward and pressed a package of dried fruit into his hands without a word. A teenage girl who looked at Lyra with such naked sympathy that Cole thought she might cry. By the time he reached the tree line, his backpack was heavier than when he'd arrived, filled not just with the supplies Sarah had given him, but with small donations from people who'd seen a baby in need and responded to that fundamental human impulse to protect the vulnerable. Cole walked back to his shelter in silence, Lyra sleeping peacefully against his chest. The forest seemed different now, less a place of exile and more a sanctuary. Here, at least, they were safe from the judgment of societies that would throw away a life for being imperfect. That evening, as Cole prepared Lyra's formula with the proper equipment Sarah had provided, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of movement through the underbrush, deliberate and careful, the sound of someone or something approaching his camp. Cole set down the bottle and reached for the only weapon he had, a sturdy branch he'd kept near his shelter for protection from wildlife. He positioned himself between the approaching sound and Lyra, his heart hammering. 3 figures emerged from the trees. They were Theralans, adults, their bodies covered in the chitinous plating that characterized their species. They stood upright on 2 powerful legs, with 4 arms that could be used for both delicate manipulation and devastating strength. Their compound eyes glittered in the fading light, multifaceted and alien, but Cole could still read the body language well enough. These were not happy visitors. The central figure, slightly larger than the others and wearing a decorative sash that marked some kind of authority, raised 2 of its hands in what Cole hoped was a peaceful gesture. When it spoke, its voice emerged from a combination of mandibles and a vocal organ in its thorax, creating a sound that was both clicking and melodic. Human, it said in heavily accented but understandable English. You have taken something that does not belong to you. Cole stood his ground, the branch held loosely in his hands. I found a dying baby in the forest, he said carefully. I gave her shelter and food. That's all. You found a returned one, the Theralans said. One given back to nature as is proper and correct. You had no right to interfere. She's a baby, Cole said, his voice hard. A helpless infant. And you left her to die in a storm. The Theralan's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound Cole interpreted as agitation. You do not understand our ways. The blind one could never contribute to the hive. She would be a burden, a drain on resources, a source of suffering for herself and all who tried to care for her. To let her live would be cruelty. To let her die is murder, Cole shot back. The two Theralans flanking the leader shifted forward slightly, and Cole tightened his grip on the branch. Behind him, he heard Lyra begin to fuss, her small voice rising in distress as if she could sense the tension. "You will return the infant," the leader said, and this voice was no longer conciliatory. It was a command. "You have 1 day to bring her to the border grove. If you do not, we will come and take her, and there will be consequences for your interference." The three Theralans turned and vanished into the forest as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving Cole standing alone in the gathering darkness, his hands shaking from adrenaline. He turned back to Lyra, who was crying now in earnest. Cole picked her up, cradling her against his chest as he'd done countless times over the past day and night. "We're not going back," he whispered to her. "I don't care what they say. We're not going back." But as he prepared her bottle and tried to soothe her, Cole knew he'd just made himself an enemy of an entire species, and he had no idea how he was going to keep them both safe. The night that followed was one of the longest of Cole's life. He couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, every sound from the forest making him jump and reach for his makeshift weapon. Lyra seemed to sense his tension and woke frequently, requiring constant attention and comfort. As dawn approached and Lyra finally fell into a deeper sleep, Cole sat with his back against a tree and tried to think rationally. He had a day before the Theralans came back. 1 day to figure out what to do, where to go, how to protect a blind alien infant from her own people. Going back to the settlement was out of the question. They'd probably hand Lyra over just to avoid conflict. Heading deeper into the wilderness might buy them time, but Cole had no illusions about being able to evade Theralan trackers in their own territory indefinitely. And without access to supplies, without the formula and equipment Sarah had given him, Lyra wouldn't survive long anyway. There had to be another way. There had to be someone who could help, some authority that would see the injustice of abandoning a helpless child and intervene. As the sun rose, Cole made his decision. There was one more human settlement on Verdana Prime, a larger colony called Haven located 3 days' travel to the north. Haven had a proper colonial administration, communication arrays capable of reaching Earth and the other human worlds, and most importantly, it had a diplomatic corps office that handled relations between humans and the various alien species in this sector. If Cole could reach Haven, if he could get his story heard by someone with actual authority, maybe he could find protection for Lyra. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. Cole spent the morning gathering everything he could carry. The donated backpack was stuffed with formula, diapers, medical supplies, and what little food he had left. He fashioned a better sling for Lyra, one that would distribute her weight more evenly and keep her more secure during the long journey ahead. He filled every container he had with water from a nearby stream. By midday, he was ready. Lyra was fed and changed, sleeping peacefully in her sling. Cole took one last look at the shelter that had been his home for 3 months, then turned north and started walking. The journey to Haven was brutal. The terrain grew more rugged as Cole moved away from the relatively gentle forests near New Portland, climbing into rocky highlands where the vegetation was sparse and the nights were cold. Lyra proved to be a surprisingly good traveler, sleeping for long stretches and accepting her feedings with minimal fuss, but the constant need to care for her, while also navigating treacherous ground, pushed Cole to his limits. On the second day, Cole's supplies began to run low. He'd underestimated how much water he'd need, both for drinking and for preparing Lyra's formula. By evening, his containers were nearly empty, and the nearest water source, according to his rough map, was half a day away. That night, as Cole huddled with Lyra in a cave he'd found for shelter, the baby began to cry in a way she hadn't before. It was a thin, keening wail that spoke of genuine distress. Cole tried everything, feeding her with the last of his water, rocking her, singing to her in his rough, untrained voice, but nothing helped. He realized with growing horror that she was dehydrated. He'd been too sparing with the water, trying to make it last, and now Lyra was suffering for it. Cole made a decision that was either brave or foolish, probably both. He waited until the darkest part of the night, then left Lyra wrapped safely in the cave and set out alone, moving as quickly as he dared in the darkness, following the dry stream bed he'd found earlier toward what he hoped was a spring or pool. The journey took 2 hours of stumbling through the dark, guided only by starlight and the vague hope that his sense of direction was correct. But finally, blessedly, he heard it, the sound of running water. The spring emerged from a crack in a cliff face, creating a small pool before continuing downhill as a stream. Cole filled his containers frantically, tasting the water to make sure it was clean enough to use. It was cold and clear, with a slightly mineral taste that suggested it came from deep underground. The trip back to the cave seemed to take forever, every minute stretching out as Cole imagined what he might find when he returned. Had the Theralans found Lyra while he was gone? Had she cried herself into distress, alone in the dark? But when he finally scrambled back into the cave, breathless and exhausted, he found Lyra exactly where he'd left her, still crying but safe. Cole's hands shook as he prepared a bottle, and the moment he lifted Lyra and let her begin feeding, the relief was so intense it almost brought him to his knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered as she drank. "I'm so sorry, little one. I'm new at this. I'm going to make mistakes. But I promise I'm trying." Lyra's small hand found his finger again, and she held on as she fed, her cries gradually subsiding into small, hiccuping sounds of relief. They reached Haven on the afternoon of the third day, and Cole had never been so grateful to see the signs of human civilization. Haven was a proper town, not just a settlement, with permanent buildings and paved streets and all the infrastructure of an established colony. It was also crawling with people, and within minutes of Cole's arrival on the outskirts, he'd attracted attention. The Diplomatic Corps office was in the center of town, a modern building that looked almost out of place among the more utilitarian structures around it. Cole walked through the front door, ignored the startled looks from the receptionist, and said in a voice that brooked no argument that he needed to speak with someone in authority immediately. To the receptionist's credit, she didn't call security. Maybe it was something she saw in Cole's face, or maybe it was the sight of Lyra's lavender skin and forearms visible in the sling. Whatever the reason, within 10 minutes Cole was sitting in a comfortable office across from a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Director Alexis Miles, head of the Diplomatic Corps on Verdana Prime. Alexis listened without interrupting as Cole told his story. She took notes on a digital pad, her expression remaining professionally neutral even as Cole described finding Lyra abandoned in the storm, the confrontation with the Theralan authorities, and his desperate flight to Haven. When Cole finished, Alexis set down her pad and looked at him with eyes that were sharp and assessing. "You understand what you're asking for," she said. "You want us to intervene in a Theralan cultural practice on behalf of an infant you have no legal right to." "I'm asking you to save a child's life," Cole said flatly. "Cultural practice is just a nice way of saying infanticide in this case." "The Theralans would argue that it's euthanasia," Alexis countered, "that they're preventing suffering rather than causing it. And from their perspective, a blind Theralan genuinely would suffer. Their entire society is built around visual communication, complex social hierarchies that depend on the ability to read body language and light patterns. A blind individual would be fundamentally isolated. So they kill them instead of adapting," Cole said bitterly. Alexis was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "I'm not defending them," she said carefully. "I'm explaining their reasoning so you understand what we're up against. The Theralans have been on Verdana Prime for thousands of years. We've been here for barely 20. We have a treaty with them, agreements about territorial boundaries and resource sharing that keep the peace. If we directly interfere in their internal affairs, we risk violating that treaty. There has to be something," Cole said, and he hated how desperate he sounded. "Some precedent, some law, something." Alexis studied him for a long moment, then stood and walked to a window overlooking the town. "There might be," she said slowly. "About 8 years ago, there was a similar case on the colony world of New Terra. An alien species called the Vorath, who practiced ritual execution of children born during certain astronomical events. A human couple adopted one of these children in secret and fought for legal custody. The case went all the way to the Interstellar Court, and the ruling was that once an individual, regardless of species, was under the care and protection of a legal guardian from a recognized sovereign state, that guardian's rights superseded the cultural practices of the individual's birth species." Cole felt a flicker of hope, So if I became Lyra's legal guardian, the Theralans couldn't touch her without violating interstellar law, Alexis finished. But there are complications. First, you need to prove that Lyra was genuinely abandoned, that no living Theralan has claim to her. Second, you need to prove that you're capable of providing adequate care for an alien infant with special needs. And third, you need to survive the political fallout. The Theralans are going to be furious, and they'll make life very difficult for all humans on Verdana Prime. I don't care about the politics, Cole said. Can you help me or not? Alexis turned back to face him, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a small smile, but genuine. I have a daughter, she said quietly. She's back on Earth with her father, and I haven't seen her in 3 years. I miss her every single day. When I look at what you've done, traveling through dangerous territory with no resources and no help, risking everything to save a child that isn't even your species, I see the kind of parent I hope I am. The kind of parent every child deserves. She walked back to her desk and began typing rapidly. I'm going to start the paperwork for emergency guardianship. It's going to take time, maybe weeks, but I'll expedite it as much as I can. In the meantime, you and Lyra are going to stay here in Haven, under the protection of the diplomatic corps. I'll assign you temporary quarters and make sure you have everything you need to care for her properly. Cole felt something break loose in his chest, some knot of tension he'd been carrying since the moment he found Lyra. Thank you, he managed to say. Don't thank me yet, Alexis warned. This is just the beginning. The hard part is going to be proving you can actually raise her. A blind Theralan infant is going to have needs you can't imagine, medical issues we don't fully understand, developmental requirements that might be completely at odds with human parenting techniques. Are you prepared for that? Cole looked down at Lyra, who was awake in his arms, her 4 small hands moving in the air as they always did, searching for input in a world she couldn't see. One of her hands found his face and touched his cheek with a gentleness that surprised him. I'll learn, he said simply. Whatever she needs, I'll learn. Over the following weeks, Cole discovered that learning was the easy part. The hard part was everything else. Alexis set him up in a small apartment in a building that housed diplomatic corps staff and their families. It was modest by Haven standards, but to Cole it felt like a palace. Running water, electricity, a real bed for the first time in months. He could have cried from the luxury of it, but he didn't have time for tears. Lyra needed him, and caring for her proved to be more complex than he'd anticipated. The first challenge was medical. Alexis connected Cole with Dr. Ethan Porter, a xenobiologist specializing in Theralan physiology. Ethan examined Lyra thoroughly and delivered news that was both encouraging and daunting. She's actually quite healthy, considering her start in life, Ethan said, reviewing the scan results on his tablet. No signs of infection or serious developmental delays. But her blindness, it's not something that can be fixed with our current medical technology. The structure of her compound eyes is fundamentally malformed. Even if we had advanced surgical options, which we don't, we'd risk doing more harm than good. So she'll be blind forever, Cole said. Not a question, but a statement of fact he needed to vocalize. Physically, yes, Ethan confirmed. But Theralans have other senses that are quite acute. Their sense of touch is far more refined than humans, and they can detect minute vibrations through their feet and lower arms. They also have a rudimentary form of echolocation, clicking sounds they make that help them navigate in dark environments. With proper training, a blind Theralan could develop these senses to compensate for the lack of vision. What kind of training? Cole asked. That's where it gets complicated, Ethan said. I don't know. No one does. As far as I can find in the records, there are no documented cases of blind Theralans surviving past infancy. The practice of returning them to nature has been consistent for as long as we've known about their species. Then we figure it out ourselves, Cole said with more confidence than he felt. And he tried. Over the next several weeks, Cole threw himself into learning everything he could about Theralan development. He read every research paper, watched every video, interviewed every scientist and diplomat who'd had extended contact with the species. He learned about their social structures, their communication patterns, their life cycle stages. And he applied it all to Lyra as best he could. He began making clicking sounds to her constantly, teaching her to recognize him by sound rather than sight. He encouraged her to explore her environment through touch, placing different textured materials in her crib and around the apartment. He took her outside despite the worried looks from neighbors and let her feel the breeze, the sunlight, the texture of tree bark and grass. Lyra responded to everything with an enthusiasm that amazed him. Her forearms were constantly moving, constantly reaching out to touch and explore. She made her own clicking sounds, experimenting with different tones and rhythms. And when Cole clicked back at her, matching her patterns, she would become excited, her little body wiggling with what could only be joy. The second major challenge was legal. Alexis worked tirelessly on the guardianship paperwork, but the Thralan authorities had responded exactly as expected. They filed formal protests, demanded Lyra's return, and threatened to sever diplomatic relations if the humans continued to harbor what they called a returned one who had no right to life. The case generated attention throughout the colony and eventually reached Earth itself. News articles appeared in major publications, some supporting Cole's actions as heroic, others condemning him as a meddling outsider who was jeopardizing human-Theralan relations for sentimental reasons. Cole tried to ignore the noise and focus on Lyra, but it was difficult when protesters occasionally gathered outside the diplomatic corps building, both human and Theralan, shouting about cultural imperialism or the sanctity of life, depending on which side they were on. The third challenge, and in some ways the most difficult, was personal. Cole had spent most of his adult life alone, responsible only for himself, free to make selfish choices without consequence. Now, he was responsible for a living being who depended on him for everything. It was exhausting in ways he hadn't anticipated. There were nights when Lyra cried for hours and nothing Cole did could soothe her. There were mornings when he woke up overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what he'd taken on. There were moments when he looked at his empty bank account, at the uncertain future, at the political firestorm surrounding them, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But then Lyra would reach out and find his hand, would make her happy clicking sounds when he entered the room, would fall asleep against his chest with a contentment that spoke of absolute trust, and Cole would remember why he was doing this. She was a person, a small, vulnerable person who deserved a chance at life. And if Cole could give her that chance, then all the hardship was worth it. 3 months after finding Lyra in the forest, Cole received word that the guardianship hearing was scheduled. It would be held before a special tribunal consisting of human colonial judges and observers from several alien species, including the Theralans. Cole would have to present his case, prove he was capable of caring for Lyra, and defend his actions against what were sure to be vigorous objections. Alexis helped him prepare, running through potential questions and arguments, coaching him on how to present himself. But she warned him repeatedly that the outcome was far from certain. The tribunal has to balance your rights as Lyra's de facto guardian against Theralan cultural sovereignty, she explained. They're going to ask hard questions about whether you're really acting in her best interest or just imposing your own values on a situation you don't fully understand. I understand that they were going to let her die, Cole said. I understand that clearly enough. Be careful with that kind of language in the hearing, Alexis warned. Emotional appeals might work with some judges, but others will see it as manipulative. Stick to the facts. Emphasize Lyra's development under your care, the bond you've formed, the plans you have for her future. The hearing took place in Haven's administrative complex, in a large chamber that had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. Cole walked in carrying Lyra, now 5 months old and noticeably bigger than when he'd found her. She was wearing a small outfit that Alexis had helped him purchase, something appropriate for the occasion, and she chirped softly as Cole took his seat at the defendant's table. The tribunal consisted of 3 human judges and 2 alien observers, one of whom was Theralan. The Theralan observer, whose name translated roughly to Counselor Varesh, watched Cole with an expression he couldn't read, those compound eyes glittering with what might have been hostility or curiosity or complete indifference. The proceedings began with a formal recitation of the case, followed by testimony from the Theralan who'd confronted Cole in the forest months earlier. Through a translator, the Theralan repeated the argument that Cole had interfered in a proper and necessary cultural practice, that Lyra had no right to life under Theralan law, and that her continued existence was an insult to their entire species. Cole listened, his jaw tight, one hand resting protectively on Lyra's back as she sat in his lap. When it was his turn to speak, Cole stood and looked directly at the judges. "I'm not a diplomat," he began. "I'm not a lawyer or a xenobiologist or anyone qualified to speak about cultural practices. I'm just a man who found a baby dying in a storm and couldn't walk away." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The Theralands say Lyra had no right to life because she's blind, that she would be a burden, that she could never contribute to their society. Maybe that's true by their standards. But I've spent 5 months caring for Lyra, watching her grow and develop, and I've seen something they never bothered to look for. Cole lifted Lyra up, positioning her so the tribunal could see her clearly. She's smart. She's curious. She's learning to navigate her world through sound and touch in ways that amaze me every day. She recognizes my voice, responds to her name, reaches out for me when she needs comfort. She's a person, not a burden. And she deserves the same chance at life that every person deserves, regardless of what species they were born into. One of the judges, an older woman named Judge Rachel Carter, leaned forward. "Mr. Bennett, we've reviewed Dr. Porter's reports on Lyra's development. While it's true she's thriving physically, there are concerns about her long-term prospects. What plans do you have for her education, for her integration into society, for her future as an adult?" "I don't have all the answers," Cole admitted, "but I'm learning. I'm working with specialists to develop techniques to help blind Theralands navigate their world. I'm building a support network of humans and open-minded Theralands who believe Lyra deserves a chance. And I'm committed to giving her every opportunity to develop her potential, whatever that might be." The Theralan observer, Counselor Varesh, spoke up then, its voice emerging through a translation device in a flat, emotionless tone. "This human cannot provide what a Theralan needs. He does not understand our social structures, our communication methods, our way of life. The blind one will grow up isolated, neither human nor Theralan, belonging nowhere." Cole turned to face the Theralan directly. "Maybe she'll create her own place," he said. "Maybe she'll find a way to bridge both worlds. Or maybe she'll struggle and face challenges I can't imagine. But those are her challenges to face, her life to live. Not a decision that should have been made for her before she had any chance to try." The hearing continued for hours, with testimony from Dr. Porter, from Alexis, from Theralan cultural experts, and from several residents of Haven who'd interacted with Cole and Lyra over the past months. Some spoke in Cole's favor, emphasizing the bond between him and the child, the obvious care he provided. Others raised concerns about the precedent being set, the potential strain on human-Theralan relations. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade outside the chamber windows, the tribunal called for a recess to deliberate. Cole sat in a waiting room with Lyra, feeding her and trying not to think about what would happen if the tribunal ruled against him. Would they take her away immediately? Would he have time to say goodbye? Would she understand why he was suddenly gone from her life? Lyra clicked softly to herself, content in his arms, completely unaware of the decision being made about her future. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only an hour, Cole was called back into the chamber. The judges were seated, their expressions grave, and Cole felt his heart sink. Judge Carter spoke for the tribunal. "This has been one of the most difficult cases this tribunal has ever heard," she began. "We've had to weigh competing interests, fundamental rights, cultural sovereignty, and the welfare of a single infant who cannot speak for herself." She paused, and Cole held his breath. "After careful deliberation, we have decided to grant Mr. Bennett temporary guardianship of the individual identified as Lyra, with permanent guardianship to be reviewed in 1 year's time. Our reasoning is as follows." Judge Carter went on to explain the tribunal's logic. They had determined that Lyra had indeed been abandoned, with no current Theralan claiming parental rights. They had found that Cole had demonstrated adequate care capability and genuine commitment to Lyra's welfare. And most importantly, they had invoked the new Terra precedent, ruling that once an individual was under the care of a guardian from a recognized state, cultural practices of the birth species could not override that guardianship without evidence of harm. However, the tribunal also imposed conditions. Cole would need to work with Theralan cultural advisors to ensure Lyra was exposed to her heritage. He would need to continue regular medical evaluations. And after 1 year, he would need to demonstrate that Lyra was developing properly and that his guardianship was in her best long-term interest. The relief that flooded through Cole was so intense, he actually swayed on his feet. Alexis, sitting beside him, grabbed his arm to steady him. "Thank you," Cole managed to say to the judges. "Thank you so much." But Judge Carter held up a hand. "Understand, Mr. Bennett, that this is only the beginning. You've won the right to try, not the guarantee of success. The next year will be closely monitored, and if we determine that Lyra's welfare is being compromised, we will not hesitate to intervene. Do you understand?" "I understand," Cole said firmly. The Theralan observer, Counselor Varesh, stood up abruptly and left the chamber without a word, its body language radiating anger or disgust. Cole watched it go and knew he'd made an enemy. But he'd also won something far more valuable. He'd won Lyra's life. That evening, back in the apartment, Cole held Lyra and let himself cry for the first time since finding her. They were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of overwhelming gratitude. Lyra chirped at him curiously, one small hand reaching up to touch the wetness on his face. "We did it," Cole whispered to her. "We get to stay together. I'm your dad now, for real." Lyra made a sound that might have been contentment and settled against his chest, her bioluminescent veins pulsing softly in the dimming light. The year that followed was the hardest and most rewarding of Cole's life. With the backing of the diplomatic corps and a small stipend provided for Lyra's care, Cole was able to rent a slightly larger apartment and dedicate himself fully to raising her. He connected with every expert he could find, built a library of resources on Theralan development, and essentially created from scratch a curriculum for a blind Theralan child. The clicking communication evolved into a sophisticated language between them. Cole learned to vary his clicks, creating patterns that indicated different activities, emotions, warnings. Lyra responded with her own patterns, and by her first birthday, measured in Verdana Prime's longer year cycle, they had developed a form of communication that was part human language, part Theralan, and part entirely unique to them. Cole also worked on helping Lyra develop her other senses. He created texture boards for her to explore, introduced her to dozens of different materials and surfaces. He played music and helped her understand rhythm and pattern in sound. He took her on long walks, teaching her to sense vibrations in the ground, to feel changes in air pressure, to build a mental map of her environment. The progress was remarkable. By 18 months, Lyra could navigate the apartment independently using a combination of clicking echolocation and memorized spatial awareness. She had favorite toys, expressed preferences in food, and showed a personality that was curious, determined, and affectionate. But there were also challenges. Lyra's blindness meant she couldn't participate in normal Theralan social behaviors. When Cole, following the tribunal's orders, arranged visits with Theralan cultural advisors, Lyra struggled to interact in ways they expected. She couldn't read the subtle body language and light patterns that formed the basis of Theralan communication. She couldn't participate in the visual games and activities that Theralan children her age would normally engage in. Some of the advisors were patient and tried to adapt. Others clearly found the whole situation distressing and argued that Cole was doing Lyra a disservice by raising her at all. Cole refused to be discouraged. If traditional Theralan communication didn't work for Lyra, then she'd learn alternative methods. If she couldn't participate in visual games, he'd invent new ones based on sound and touch. If other Theralans couldn't understand her, then he'd teach her to communicate with the many species in this sector who didn't rely primarily on vision. He also worked hard to give Lyra a connection to her heritage. He learned Theralan songs and sang them to her in his admittedly terrible voice. He cooked Theralan foods, read her Theralan stories, decorated the apartment with Theralan art. He wanted her to grow up knowing where she came from, even if she couldn't fully participate in that culture. As the one-year review approached, Cole felt cautiously optimistic. Lyra was healthy, happy, and developing remarkably well given the circumstances. Dr. Porter's reports were glowing. Even some of the Theralan advisors had grudgingly admitted that Lyra seemed to be thriving. But there was one complication Cole hadn't anticipated. Lyra had started asking questions. Not in words. Exactly, since her language development combined English words, Theralan clicks, and gestures in a unique hybrid. But the meaning was clear. She wanted to know why she was different. Why Cole only had 2 arms instead of 4. Why the other Theralans she met treated her strangely. why she couldn't see the things Cole described to her. Cole tried to explain in ways a young child could understand. He told her that people came in all different shapes and sizes, with all different abilities. That being blind just meant she experienced the world differently, not less. That he loved her exactly as she was. But children have a way of cutting through comforting lies to the heart of painful truths. The Theralans who visit us, Lyra said one day in her clicking language hybrid. They think I'm wrong. They think I shouldn't be here. Cole knelt down to her level, making sure she could feel his presence close to her. Some of them think that, he admitted, because he'd promised himself he would always be honest with her. They have old ideas about what's normal and what isn't. But they're wrong, Lyra. You belong here. You belong anywhere you want to be. Why did my first parents leave me? Lyra asked, and Cole's heart broke a little. He'd known this question would come eventually, but he still wasn't prepared for it. They were scared, he said carefully. They didn't understand that being blind doesn't mean you can't have a wonderful life. They made a mistake, a very bad mistake. But that mistake is what brought you to me, and I will always be grateful for that. Lyra was quiet for a moment, processing. Are you my real parent now? She asked. Yes, Cole said without hesitation. I'm your dad, for real and forever. Lyra reached out and found his hand, holding it with all four of hers in a gesture she'd developed that meant love and security and home. Good, she said simply. The one-year review hearing was much shorter than the first one. The tribunal reviewed Dr. Porter's reports, interviewed Cole and several observers, and watched video recordings of Lyra navigating her environment and communicating with Cole. Judge Carter, presiding again, looked genuinely impressed as she watched Lyra demonstrate her clicking echolocation, identifying objects placed around a room by their acoustic signatures. Mr. Bennett, the judge said when the presentation was complete. I'll be honest. When we granted you temporary guardianship, I had doubts about whether this arrangement could work long-term. But what you've accomplished with Lyra is nothing short of extraordinary. You haven't just kept her alive. You've given her tools to thrive in a world not designed for her limitations. She's the extraordinary one, Cole said. I just gave her the opportunity. Judge Carter smiled. This tribunal grants permanent guardianship of Lyra to Cole Bennett, effective immediately. We find that Mr. Bennett has more than demonstrated his capability and commitment, and that Lyra's best interests are served by remaining in his care. The relief this time was different from before. Less desperate, more settled. This wasn't just a reprieve anymore. This was real, permanent, final. There was one more surprise. Counselor Varesh, the Theralan observer who'd been so hostile at the first hearing, requested to speak. The tribunal granted permission, and Varesh stood, its compound eyes fixed on Cole. I opposed this human's guardianship, Varesh said through the translator. I believed he could not provide what a Theralan needs. I believed the blind one would suffer. Cole braced himself for whatever attack was coming. But Varesh continued, and its tone had changed. I have watched this child over the past cycle. I have seen what she has become under this human's care, and I have been forced to reconsider beliefs I have held my entire life. The Theralan paused, and when it spoke again, there was something in its artificial voice that might have been respect. Perhaps we Theralans have been wrong. Perhaps we have discarded lives that could have contributed in ways we never imagined. This child, Lyra, she is different from what we expected, but she is not less. She is not a burden. She is, simply, herself. Varesh turned to the tribunal. I recommend that this case be studied by Theralan authorities, that we reconsider our practices regarding imperfect births. This human has taught us something we should have learned long ago. Then Varesh did something Cole had never seen a Theralan do. It approached him directly and extended one of its four hands in what was clearly meant as a gesture of respect. Cole took the hand, feeling the cool, smooth texture of Theralan chitin. Thank you for your stubbornness, human, Varesh said. You have saved more than one life today. As the years passed, Lyra grew from a toddler into a young child, and then into what Cole recognized as the beginning of adolescence in Theralan development. She was 7 Earth years old, nearly 6 in Verdana Prime cycles, when the real test of everything Cole had taught her arrived. The human settlement of Haven had grown significantly, and with it came more interaction between species. A new school had been established that accepted students of all species, an experiment in cross-cultural education that was being watched closely by authorities throughout the sector. Cole had been homeschooling Lyra, working with various tutors to give her the best education he could. But Lyra had started expressing interest in the new school, in meeting other children, in being part of something bigger than just her and Cole. Cole was terrified. He'd protected Lyra for so long, carefully controlling her environment, making sure she was safe and supported. The idea of sending her out into a school where other children might be cruel, where teachers might not understand her needs, where she'd have to navigate social situations without his help, it kept him awake at night. But Lyra wanted it. And Cole had learned over the years that Lyra was far more capable than his protective instincts wanted to admit. So he enrolled her, with extensive discussions with the school administrators about accommodations and support. He insisted on a gradual transition, starting with just a few hours a week. And he made it clear that if Lyra struggled or was mistreated, he'd pull her out immediately. The first day of school, Cole walked Lyra to the building, his stomach in knots. "You don't have to do this," he told her for probably the 10th time. "We can keep doing lessons at home. It's fine." Lyra clicked at him in a pattern he'd learned meant affectionate exasperation. "Dad," she said, using the English word she'd adopted. "I want to meet other kids. I want to learn new things. Stop worrying so much." "I'm your parent," Cole said. "Worrying is literally my job." Lyra's mandibles, now more pronounced as she matured, moved in what Cole had learned was her version of a smile. "Then do your job from home," she said. "I'll be fine." A teaching assistant, a young woman named Emily Parker who'd volunteered to be Lyra's support person, came out to meet them. She greeted Lyra warmly, using the clicking patterns Cole had taught the school staff. "Ready for your first day?" Emily asked. Lyra straightened up, all four arms moving in a gesture of confidence. "Very ready," she said. Cole watched them walk into the school together, Lyra using her clicking echolocation to navigate the unfamiliar hallway, and it took every ounce of willpower he had not to follow them inside. The first few weeks were an adjustment for everyone. Lyra had to learn to navigate a much larger space with many more people than she was used to. The other children had to learn how to interact with someone who couldn't see them, who communicated in a unique hybrid of languages, who looked different from both the human and Duralan children they knew. There were incidents. A group of older kids made fun of Lyra's clicking, mimicking her in cruel tones until a teacher intervened. Another child, meaning well but ignorant, asked Lyra why her parents hadn't fixed her. One particularly difficult week, Lyra came home every day in tears, overwhelmed by the social complexity and the constant need to explain herself. Cole came very close to pulling her out, but Lyra insisted she wanted to keep trying. "I can do this," she told him. "I just need time." And she was right. Gradually, Lyra began to find her place. She made friends with a human girl named Grace Mitchell who had a younger brother with special needs and understood what it meant to navigate the world differently. She impressed her teachers with her quick mind and creative problem-solving. She even started a small revolution in how the school approached accessibility, as administrators realized that accommodating Lyra's needs made the school better for all students. The turning point came during a science fair in Lyra's second year at the school. She'd been working on a project about echolocation, comparing how different species used sound to navigate their environments. Her display included demonstrations with human-made sonar equipment, recordings of Duralan clicking patterns, and even live demonstrations of her own abilities. During the fair, a delegation of Duralan officials visited the school, part of an ongoing diplomatic exchange. One of them, an elder named Counselor Taryn, stopped at Lyra's display and watched in silence as she demonstrated her echolocation, identifying objects hidden behind barriers using only sound. When she finished, Counselor Taryn approached her. "You are the blind one," the elder said in Duralan, which Lyra understood perfectly, the one raised by the human. "I'm Lyra," she responded in the same language, her accent unique but clear. "And yes, Cole Bennett is my dad. I knew your birth parents," Counselor Taryn said quietly. "They were young, frightened. They believed they were doing the right thing by returning you to nature. They were wrong," Lyra said, not with anger, but with simple certainty. "Yes," Counselor Taryn agreed. "They were wrong. As was I. I was one of the counselors who advised them, who told them a blind child could not survive, could not contribute. I have carried that decision for many cycles, wondering what became of you." The elder paused, and when it spoke again, there was something in its voice that translated as sorrow. "I am glad you proved us wrong, young one. Glad that the human had more wisdom than we did." After that encounter, something shifted in the Thralan community on Verdana Prime. Word spread about Lyra, about what she'd accomplished, about the life she was building. Other Theralans began to question the old practices. A few even came forward with stories of their own children born with imperfections, children they had grieved for cycles after returning them to nature. It was slow, painful change. Cultural practices thousands of years old don't shift easily. But Lyra had become living proof that the old assumptions were wrong, that different didn't mean less, that accommodation was better than abandonment. Cole watched his daughter grow into a remarkable young person, and he felt a pride that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. This girl who'd been left to die in a storm had become a voice for change, a bridge between species, a living argument for compassion over tradition. But more than any of that, she'd become his daughter in every way that mattered. And he'd become the father he'd never imagined he could be. One evening, when Lyra was almost 9 years old in Earth years, she came home from school with news that made Cole's heart stop. "There's a blind Thralan infant at the medical center," she said without preamble. "The parents are new colonists from the homeworld. They don't know what to do. Dr. Porter told me about it because he thought I might want to meet them." Cole set down the dinner he'd been preparing. "Do you want to?" he asked carefully. "Yes," Lyra said. "I want to tell them their baby can have a good life. That being blind doesn't mean being broken." 2 days later, Cole and Lyra visited the medical center together. The Thralan parents were young, probably barely adults by their species standards, and they looked at Lyra with a mixture of hope and confusion. Through Lyra's patient explanation and her demonstrations of her abilities, Cole watched the parents' expressions change. He watched them see their infant daughter not as a tragedy, but as a person with potential. He watched them make the decision to keep her, to raise her, to love her despite their fear. As they left the medical center, Lyra reached out and found Cole's hand with one of hers. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Cole asked. "For showing me that love is more important than sight," Lyra said. "For teaching me that I could be anything I wanted to be. For being my dad when no one else wanted me." Cole had to stop walking because his vision had blurred with tears. "You saved me too. You know," he told her. "I was lost before I found you. No purpose, no direction, no reason to be better than I was. You gave me all of that." They stood together in the evening light, human and Thralan, father and daughter, two people who'd saved each other in a forest during a storm. "We're a good team," Lyra said. "The best team," Cole agreed. The colony on Verdana Prime continued to grow and evolve, and with it, the relationship between humans and Theralans slowly shifted. It would take generations for old prejudices to fully fade, for new understanding to take root. But seeds had been planted, and they were growing. Cole Bennett, the vagrant who'd once had nothing, now had everything that mattered. He had a daughter he loved more than life itself. He had a purpose that gave meaning to every day. He had proven that sometimes the most profound act of courage is simply refusing to walk away from someone in need. And Lyra, the baby who'd been left to die because she was deemed imperfect, grew into a young woman who would change the world, not despite her blindness, but incorporating it into everything she was. She became a teacher, showing other Theralans with disabilities that they too could thrive. She became an ambassador, bridging the gap between species with her unique perspective. She became an advocate, fighting for the rights of all beings to be valued for who they were rather than judged for what they lacked. Years later, when Cole was an old man and Lyra was fully grown, they sat together on the porch of the home they'd built on the outskirts of Haven. The forest stretched out before them, the same forest where their story had begun. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you hadn't found me that night?" Lyra asked. Cole was quiet for a moment, considering. "I probably would have died out there eventually," he admitted. "Maybe not right away, but I was on a path that didn't lead anywhere good. You gave me a reason to live, not just survive." "I think we both got lucky," Lyra said. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Cole said. "You survived because you're strong. I found you because I was in the right place at the right time. What we built together, that was choice and love and stubborn refusal to accept what everyone said was impossible. Lyra made a clicking pattern that Cole had learned long ago meant contentment and peace. "I'm writing a book," she said, "about our story, about how we found each other. What are you going to call it?" Cole asked. "I'm thinking something simple," Lyra said. "Maybe just The Blind One and the Vagrant." "What do you think?" "I think it needs a better title," Cole said with a laugh. "That makes us both sound pathetic." "We were pathetic," Lyra pointed out. "And then we weren't. That's the whole point." "Fair enough," Cole conceded. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over Verdana Prime, painting the sky in colors Lyra could never see, but could feel in the cooling air and hear in the evening songs of native birds. Cole described it all to her, as he had done countless times over the years, and she listened with the same attention she'd given his descriptions when she was an infant. "I love you, Dad," Lyra said suddenly. "I love you too, kiddo," Cole responded. "More than I knew it was possible to love anything." "I know," Lyra said. "I've always known." And in that moment, Cole Bennett understood that this was what mattered. Not the grand political changes they'd helped inspire, not the legal precedents they'd set, not even the other lives they'd saved by proving that different didn't mean less. What mattered was this simple truth: a father and daughter who'd found each other in the darkest moment of their lives and built something beautiful from the ashes of abandonment and despair. The forest where it all began whispered in the evening breeze, holding the memory of a rainy night and a crying infant and a vagrant who refused to walk away. It had witnessed the beginning of their story, this ancient woodland, and now it bore silent testimony to everything they'd become. Cole looked at his daughter, this remarkable person who'd once been considered unworthy of life, and he felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the storm that led him to her. Gratitude for the stubborn courage that made him pick her up. Gratitude for every difficult day and sleepless night and moment of doubt that had led to this peaceful evening on a porch with the person he loved most in the universe. Lyra stood up, stretching her 4 arms in a gesture of contentment. "I should start dinner," she said. "It's my turn to cook. Want help?" Cole offered. "Always," Lyra said, and together they went inside, leaving the forest to its twilight songs and ancient memories. The story that had begun with abandonment and ended with love would be told for generations, across species and worlds, as evidence of what humanity brought to the galaxy. Not superior technology or military might, but something far more powerful: the simple, radical belief that every life had value, that love transcended biology, that family was defined not by genetics, but by choice and commitment. Cole Bennett had been a vagrant, a nobody with nothing. But he'd become a father, a hero, a proof that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is care when everyone else has given up. And Lyra had been a blind infant left to die, but she'd become a teacher, a bridge, a living testament to the power of second chances and unwavering love. Their story was humanity's story in miniature, finding value where others saw none, building homes where others saw only wilderness, loving without reservation or condition. It was the story of why humans, for all their flaws and failings, had something essential to offer the wider galaxy. It was, quite simply, the story of why humanity mattered. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.